Today's video will follow the hidden war waged against childhood itself, telling the story of Holocaust children and the ways a scattered few survived through rescue transports, false identities, underground networks, and the long, uneven road back to a life that could make sense again. Holocaust Children, Stories of Survival is not just a chapter of World War II. It is a ledger of stolen names and recovered ones, proof that the smallest lives were forced to carry the heaviest history. Even now, this subject keeps pulling people back because it is the clearest test of humanity under pressure. What adults protected, what they ignored, and what children endured when the world stopped behaving like a world. This week, as fresh discussions and renewed attention bring survivor voices back into public view, the old question returns with sharp edges. How did any child make it through? And why did so many doors stay closed until it was too late? Because what is at stake in this story is not only memory, it is accountability. The uncomfortable truth that some lives were lost, not only to cruelty, but to delay. I want you to picture the world as it was then, blacked out streets, ration lines, radios turned low, and a continent being reorganized by force while governments argued over paperwork as if time were still generous. In that climate, a child's survival could depend on a stamp, a whispered password, a forged card, or the courage of a stranger who understood that hiding a child was an act of war. And behind the front lines, beyond the speeches and headlines, there were quieter operations that rarely make the grand summaries, networks moving children under new names, safe rooms prepared in ordinary houses, clandestine messengers carrying addresses in their heads, and intelligence channels that knew more than the public was ever told, even as trains kept running and borders stayed tight. So tonight, I'm opening that record the way it should be opened, with the child at the center, not the generals. We are going to walk through the 5 paths that separated life from disappearance, the narrow legal exits, the rescue programs that saved some and left others behind, the underground concealment that demanded silence from children who should have been laughing, the sealed systems where endurance became the only language, and the post-war aftermath where survival did not end but changed shape. And we will also ask the question that history hates, because it makes excuses collapse. What if the world had moved faster? What if rescue had been treated as urgent? And what if the repair of shattered childhood had been planned with the same discipline used to wage war? If you're ready, come with me now to the first door, the first name change, the first moment an adult looks at a child and decides whether to act or look away, because once you understand how these children survived, you will never hear the word bystander the same way again. I want you to picture something small before I say anything else. A child's exercise book, edges softened by damp hands, a stitched name label inside a coat, a pair of ice skates that never quite fit, a doll held too tightly on a railway platform because the child carrying it has no other proof she belongs to anyone at all. When people speak of the Holocaust, they often reach for the grand numbers first. They count the dead, the borders crossed, the armies moved, the dates stamped into history. But children do not live inside numbers. Children live inside objects, whispers, rules they cannot understand, and sudden decisions made by adults who are trembling and trying to look calm. I am speaking to you as a man of the mid-century, the sort of witness who learned to read history in the faces of survivors and in the quiet gaps where a sentence stops. I have sat with men and women who were once children in those years, and I have listened to the way the past returns to them. It does not return like a parade. It returns like a draft under a door at night, a word, a smell, a train whistle, a knock. This story is about Holocaust children and the ways they survived. It is also about the brutal truth that most did not. If you stay with me, I will not dress this up. I will not offer you comfort that history does not deserve. But I will give you something else, something stronger than comfort. I will give you clarity. And then I will do something that makes some historians uneasy. I will ask a question that feels almost forbidden, not because it is disrespectful, but because it forces us to see how close the world came to choosing differently. What if? Not fantasy, not wishful thinking. Just the hard, practical question of which doors were half open, which decisions could have been widened by policy, money, courage, or shame, and which lives might have slipped through if the world had moved faster. If you want a best-case history, you cannot pretend evil never existed. You have to identify the hinge points. You have to walk right up to the moment a choice was made, and then ask what would have happened if the choice had been made in the direction of life. So I am going to lay out the main what-if roads in front of us, and then we will drive them carefully, with the real landscape of the time beneath our tires. Here are the scenarios I want you to hold in your mind, not as entertainment, but as a test. First, what if rescue had been scaled earlier, not in the final minutes, but when the warning signs were loud and public, when refugees were begging, when officials were still stamping papers as if time were infinite? Second, what if nations had treated children as a priority with urgency, not as a charity project, not as a quota problem, but as a moral emergency that deserved speed, ships, and budgets? Third, what if the underground networks that hid children, moved them, fed them, forged their identities, had been supplied with steady outside support rather than scraps, rumors, and desperate improvisation? Fourth, what if, after the war, the world had met the surviving children with a system built for repair, not confusion? What if reunification, medical care, education, and psychological support had been organized with the same discipline used to move armies? There are more, but those four are enough to expose the truth. The best case version of this history is not a miracle. It is paperwork, access, transport, and political will. It is adults deciding that children are not a problem to manage, but lives to protect. Now let me bring you back to the actual world these children lived in. It begins, as so many tragedies do, with ordinary life still trying to be ordinary. School, chores, birthdays, then restrictions, then exclusion, then separation. For Jewish children across Europe, the shift was sometimes sudden, sometimes creeping. A teacher no longer called on you. A friend's mother said she could not come out to play. A sign appeared in a shop window. A rule changed. A curfew. A star. A new kind of silence at the dinner table when adults spoke in fragments and stopped when a child entered the room. And then came the great machinery of removal. It did not only remove bodies, it removed names, routines, confidence, language itself. A child learns the world by repetition. The Holocaust shattered repetition. It taught children that rules could reverse overnight, and that the safest habit was not trust, but vigilance. We talk about hidden children now with a kind of reverence, as if hiding were a single act, like stepping behind a curtain. But hiding was a life built from hundreds of exhausting details. A false name that had to be remembered even in sleep. A prayer learned quickly in case someone asked. A way of walking, a way of speaking, a way of not speaking. A child learning to be smaller, quieter, less visible, because visibility had become dangerous. In some places, hiding meant a literal confinement. In others, it meant being passed from family to family, from convent to farmhouse, always with the knowledge that a wrong glance could turn a rescuer into an enemy out of fear. Survival depended not only on courage, but on the steadiness of strangers. And the children in ghettos faced a different kind of test. There, the danger was not invisibility, but endurance. Hunger became a constant companion, not dramatic, not theatrical, but grinding. Children watched adults grow thin and tried to pretend they were not hungry so their parents would not feel guilt. Children became messengers, smugglers, runners, because small bodies could slip through gaps, some children wrote. That may sound like a soft detail, but it is one of the most defiant acts a person can do under persecution. Writing says, I am still here. Writing says, you do not get to erase me completely. When I read the diaries and the fragments of diaries, what strikes me is not only the fear, it is the intelligence. These were not naive scribbles. They were sharp observations, often painfully mature, because childhood itself had been interrupted. A teenager in a ghetto writing about hunger, about the tension inside families, about rumors and radio news, about a world narrowing day by day. A young girl in occupied Hungary, writing with the clarity of someone who can sense the trap closing but cannot persuade the adults around her to believe it fully. A boy in a Czech ghetto drawing, writing, making a magazine with other youths, as if culture itself could be a shield. Their words do not need embellishment. They are already too strong. But let us not pretend diaries were common. They were rare because paper was rare, because privacy was rare, because survival often demanded motion, and motion destroys fragile things. Most children left no diary because they left no time. We have to respect that absence too. Now, the first what-if road begins, before the worst years, before the full scope was undeniable, when the world still had the luxury of disbelief. Imagine the late 1930s. The danger is visible. Laws, violence, arrests, the tightening of daily life. Families try to leave. They apply for visas. They gather documents. They wait for appointments. They wait for numbers. They wait for someone to say yes. This is where the best-case story could have been written with ink instead of blood. What if more governments had loosened their immigration restrictions and treated Jewish refugees as a priority rather than a burden? What if the conferences and committees had produced ships, not sympathy? What if the quotas had been expanded in practice, not only in speeches? I want you to feel how practical this is. A child does not need a grand strategy. A child needs a stamp on a paper, a place on a train, a bed at the other end. One of the most significant rescue actions that actually happened, and I mean truly happened, not imagined, was the Kindertransport, which brought nearly 10,000 children to Britain. Let that number settle in your mind. 10,000. Nearly 10,000 children removed from the path of destruction, not by an army, but by policy and logistics. Now, here is the ruthless question. What if it had been 50,000? What if it had been 100,000? What if it had been designed not only for children, but also for at least one parent? So the rescue did not require the tearing apart of families as a condition of survival. Because that is the hidden cruelty of even successful rescue. Many children were saved at the price of never seeing their parents again. They arrived with a suitcase, perhaps a toy, perhaps a sweater, perhaps a tag pinned to their coat, and they stepped into a foreign language and an uncertain future. When you speak to those who were rescued this way, you hear gratitude, yes, but you also hear the permanent ache of separation. A child can survive and still carry loss like an extra organ for the rest of life. So in our best-case scenario, we do not only scale the rescue, we improve its design. Now, be honest, would the world have done that? In the late 1930s, fear of war was everywhere. Economic anxiety, suspicion of foreigners, a stubborn belief that there is only so much we can do. There were people who argued for more rescue, and people who argued against it, and those arguments were not abstract. They were political. They were ugly. They were influenced by prejudice and by calculations of popularity. So, the best-case version of the Kindertransport is not a matter of imagination. It is a matter of leadership choosing moral risk over political safety. And if you doubt the power of leadership, look at the opposite. Look at what happened when leadership chose persecution. The machinery moved quickly, with confidence, with coordination. That is what makes the slow response of the outside world so painful. The persecutors treated their plan as urgent. The rescuers treated rescue as optional. Now shift your attention to occupied Europe, where another kind of rescue took place, the kind that never appears on a diplomatic schedule. The hiding of children. In Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Poland, and elsewhere, networks formed, some religious, some political, some purely human. They moved children from danger into concealment. They provided false identity papers. They found families willing to take enormous risk. This is where our third what-if road becomes most vivid. What if those networks had been supported with steady funding, supplies, and communication from outside? What if the underground had been treated as a strategic priority, the way sabotage and intelligence were treated? Here is the reality. Many networks operated on courage and improvisation. A forged document required the right paper, the right stamps, the right handwriting, and often a bribe. A child needed food. A child needed clothing that matched the new identity. A child needed a story that could withstand questioning. Now imagine if those networks had reliable resources. Imagine if they had safe houses stocked and ready. Imagine if escape routes were mapped with discipline. Imagine if there had been a system to rotate children so no one household carried the risk too long. Would that have saved every child? No. Do not insult reality. But it would have saved more. And it would have reduced the number of cases where children were discovered because a rescuer ran out of money, or a child fell ill and needed a doctor, or a neighbor noticed unusual ration patterns. This is the grim truth. Survival often depended on mundane details. Hunger, illness, and paperwork killed as surely as bullets. If you want to understand how children survived, you have to respect the logistics of survival, not only the drama. Now, let me bring you to a scene that repeats in testimony again and again across countries and languages. A child is told to be quiet. Sometimes the parent says it. Sometimes a stranger says it. Sometimes it is said with love, sometimes with urgency, sometimes with fear. The child learns that sound can betray. The child learns that crying must be swallowed. The child learns to read adult faces for clues. There is a particular kind of terror in childhood secrecy. Adults can carry secrets with context. Children carry secrets like stones. In the best-case version of this history, we do not pretend children can bear the full weight alone. We build systems around them that reduce the need for impossible discipline. We create safer corridors. We create faster exits. We create places where a child can breathe. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, but the world was at war. Everything was chaos. How could anyone do more? Let me answer you plainly. War is chaos, yes, but war is also organization. Armies are fed, moved, equipped. Intelligence is gathered, analyzed, distributed. Ships cross oceans. Trains run. Orders are executed. When a state decides something matters, it finds a way. So when we ask, what if more children were saved, we are not asking for magic, we are asking for priority. Now, let us walk into the years when the danger became unavoidable, when ghettos were sealed, when deportations began, when whispers turned into screams behind closed doors, when a rumor could mean life or death. In ghettos like Kuch, children endured not only hunger but the slow collapse of normal time. Days became about survival. Schooling fractured, families argued under pressure. News traveled in fragments. Some youths clung to study as if study itself were a protest. Others took to the streets to find food, to work, to trade. This is where the diaries hit hardest. Not because they are sensational, but because they reveal a mind trying to stay intact. A teenage diarist writes about hunger as a daily fact, about the exhaustion of waiting, about the humiliations, about the small dramas within a family trapped in a shrinking world. The diary becomes a place where the writer can still think freely, even while the body weakens. And then, too often, the writing stops. Not because the story ends neatly. It stops because the writer no longer can. When I say this is a story of survival, I am not promising you that survival was common. I am telling you survival was extraordinary. Now, the second what if road takes us into those years when the outside world had more information than it liked to admit and still moved slowly. What if the Allies and neutral countries had responded more aggressively to reports of mass murder and deportations? What if they had prioritized refugee intake even during wartime, rather than treating it as a distraction? This is not an easy argument because wartime resources are finite. But again, priority matters. Imagine an emergency program designed specifically for children with simplified visa processes, rapid transport, and coordinated sponsorship. Imagine international pressure campaigns aimed at opening corridors for minors. Imagine the use of diplomatic leverage, not always successful, but persistent. In the best-case scenario, You do not wait for the end of the war to discover the children. You look for them while the war is still burning. Now, do not misunderstand me. I am not claiming this would have been clean or simple. Many children were trapped in places where exit was nearly impossible. Borders were closed. Collaboration and betrayal were everywhere. Some families could not bear the idea of separation, even if separation might have saved the child. Others made the choice and lived with the wound forever. But some children could have been moved if the channels had been wider. You will notice how often we return to the same theme: channels, routes, access. The vocabulary of rescue is not poetic. It is administrative. Now, let me speak of one more category of child survival, the one that sits like a shadow over everything else: camps. I will not describe atrocities in detail. You do not need me to do that, and you do not deserve to be dragged through it for the sake of spectacle. What matters here is the child's position in a system designed to erase them. Children in camps were vulnerable in every way. They were small, dependent, easily separated, easily missed, easily targeted by scarcity and cruelty. And yet some survived, often through the protection of a parent, a sibling, a stranger, or through a series of narrow escapes that still sound like disbelief when spoken aloud decades later. A child survives because a mother refuses to let go. A child survives because someone shares bread. A child survives because a guard looks away. A child survives because a number is misread, because a line moves, because chance falls for once on the side of life. In our best-case scenario, we do not depend on chance. But here is the bitter truth. Within the machinery of extermination, the room for policy rescue shrinks. That is why the earlier hinge points matter so much. Every month of delay reduces options. Every closed border becomes a death sentence for children who never committed a crime beyond being born. Now, let me bring you to August 1945, because this is where many people like to end the story, with liberation, with relief, with the idea that the nightmare simply stopped. It did not stop. It changed shape. In Britain, a group of child survivors arrived and were taken to a place of recovery in the Lake District. Many were boys, teenagers, hardened by what they had seen, and yet still young enough to be reshaped by care. They had to learn how to live without constant fear, how to eat without hoarding, how to sleep without waking at every sound. People like to tell this as a clean arc, suffering to healing. I will not insult you with that simplicity. Rehabilitation was real, and it was also incomplete. Many survivors carried nightmares and grief that no fresh countryside could erase. Some built new lives anyway, because that is what humans do when they have no other choice. They studied, they worked, they married, they raised children. They learned to laugh again, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with defiance. Now, this is where our fourth what-if road becomes urgent. What if the post-war response had been designed around children as a priority, not as an afterthought? What if there had been a coordinated effort to locate surviving children, reunite families, document identities, and provide structured education and long-term care? Because after the war, many children were alone. Some did not know their real names anymore. Some had been raised under false identities and did not know whether to return to Judaism or stay with the families who had hidden them. Some had no one left at all. There were tracing services and humanitarian efforts, yes. There were people working tirelessly. But the scale of the need was enormous, and the systems were often slow, fragmented, burdened by bureaucracy and politics. In the best-case scenario, the world treats child survivors not as symbols, but as patients, students, citizens in the making. The world builds stable environments, not temporary solutions. The world funds schools, training, counseling, medical care, and community support. And here is the part you may not like to hear. A best-case outcome is not only saving lives, it is preventing the damage from replicating itself through generations. Children who survive without support can still be harmed by survival. Trauma can shape parenting, relationships, identity. A child can live and still feel permanently unsafe. That is not a failure of the child. That is a failure of the world that rescued too late and repaired too little.
So, what does this mean for our story? Right now, at the beginning.
It means we are going to tell the truth in two layers. The first layer is the real history. The ghettos, the hiding, the transports, the rescue efforts that did happen, the diaries, the testimonies, the children who made it through. The second layer is the what-if layer, the set of best-case alternatives that reveal where the world had leverage and did not use it. And I want you, as you listen, to do something specific. Do not treat these what-if scenarios as entertainment. Treat them as accountability. Because if a system failed children once, it can fail them again under new names and new flags. The lesson of this history is not only to mourn. The lesson is to recognize the early signs, to widen the channels, to move faster than the perpetrators. Now, let us begin with a child on a train, because so many of these stories begin that way. A platform, crowded, adults trying to look brave, a child given instructions that sound like a riddle. Say your new name. Do not speak your old one. Do not cry. Keep your bag close. If someone asks, you are going to your aunt. You are going to the countryside. You are going to school. Some children were sent away by parents who understood the danger with terrifying clarity. Others were sent by parents who hoped it was temporary, who believed the world would come to its senses. Some parents did not have the option to send a child away at all, and some children were already alone. When a child is separated from family, the world becomes a series of tests. Who can be trusted? Which door opens? Which question is safe? Which question is a trap? In Britain, children arrived and were placed with foster families, hostels, farms. Some were treated kindly, some were used as labor, some were treated as inconvenient guests. A child might learn English quickly and still feel like a ghost in the house, present but not fully belonging. In the best-case scenario, these placements are supported properly. The foster families are trained. The children are given language support. Their cultural identity is respected. They are not expected to be grateful in a way that silences their grief. Now you can see how the best-case version of this history is not only about saving the child from immediate danger, it is about saving the child from being permanently unmoored. But we are not yet at that stage. Right now, in this opening movement, we are still in the years when the outcome is uncertain and every day could flip the story. So I will take you next into the hidden rooms and the disguised lives, into the prayers learned by rote, into the careful footsteps above floorboards, into the small acts of kindness that were, in their own way, acts of war. And as we go, keep those 4 questions alive in your mind. What if rescue had been scaled earlier? What if children had been treated as an emergency, not a quota? What if underground protection had been supplied like a strategy? What if post-war repair had been built like a system? Because by the time we reach the end of the war, we will have to face a fact that is hard to say plainly. For many children, the best-case scenario existed, but the world did not choose it in time. And for the ones who did survive, the question becomes not only how they stayed alive, but how they learned to live again when the world that should have protected them finally arrived, late, ashamed, and unprepared. There is a moment in every survivor's story that never shows up on a battlefield map. It is the moment a pen touches paper. A clerk hesitates. A border guard looks up. A stamp comes down, or it does not. A door opens just wide enough for a child, or it stays shut and the child becomes a rumor, a missing name, a photograph that no one can bear to look at. If you want to understand how Holocaust children survived, you must stop thinking only in terms of armies and start thinking in terms of access. Not philosophy. Access. Trains, visas, ration cards, safe rooms, false identities, and the courage of strangers. And now I am going to pull you closer to the central question that keeps returning, no matter how many testimonies I have read or how many quiet conversations I have had with people who were once those children. What if the world had treated child rescue the way it treated wartime production? Not with pity, with urgency, not with speeches, with capacity, not with as much as we can, with as much as it takes. Stay with me, because I am going to do two things at once. I am going to keep faith with the historical world as it was, and I am going to walk you through several best-case outcomes that were possible, not because history is a toy, but because these hinge points were real. They existed. They were debated. They were delayed. They were sometimes rejected for reasons that still stain the record. And to make this clear, I am going to organize what follows around a simple idea. In those years, children survived through 5 channels: legal escape, organized rescue, underground concealment, endurance inside sealed systems, post-war recovery, and identity repair. Every child who survived did so through one or more of these channels. And every best-case scenario that could have saved more children would have widened these channels. So let me begin with the first and most uncomfortable truth. The earliest opportunity to save the largest number of children came before the world was ready to admit how bad it would become. That is where the failures were loudest. And it is where the best-case alternative is most damning because it is the simplest. Widen the doors before the fire reaches them. In the late 1930s, the evidence of danger was not hidden. It was public. Violence, arrests, dispossession, laws written to isolate. Families tried to leave. They queued. They applied. They gathered documents like talismans, birth certificates, proof of funds, sponsorship letters, affidavits, anything that might persuade a foreign official to say yes. I have studied those procedures. I have studied the language used by governments. You can feel the difference between a country that sees refugees as human beings and a country that sees them as a problem. In one, the paperwork is an emergency bridge. In the other, it is a maze designed to exhaust. Now, the best-case scenario here is not romantic. It is administrative bravery. What if the major immigration countries had expanded quotas in practice, simplified requirements for minors, and created fast lanes for families with children? What if the world had accepted that the risk of letting in endangered children was smaller than the risk of letting them die? This is where many people grow defensive. They say, but there was unemployment, there was fear, there was anti-Semitism, there were spies. As if those phrases end the argument. They do not. They only explain why moral failures are so easy to justify. If you want the truth, here it is. States can do hard things quickly when they want to. They did it for wartime industry. They did it for troop movements. They did it for rationing. They did it for intelligence. So the question is not capability, it is priority. Now let me move from legal escape to organized rescue, because here the evidence is plain. A large-scale child rescue did happen. It was not perfect, it was painful. But it worked, and that fact should haunt anyone who claims nothing could be done. Children were brought to Britain through a rescue effort that moved nearly 10,000 minors away from the closing net. Some arrived with a tag pinned to their coat. Some carried a suitcase that looked too large for their small frame. Some had a toy, a doll, a puppet, a sketchbook, a sweater. When you see those items preserved later, they look almost ridiculous in their innocence. But to a child, an object can be a whole world. It is proof of continuity when everything else has been cut away. Now I want you to think about a best-case version of that rescue. Not a dream, a scaling. What if it had been 20,000, 50,000, 100,000? What if the idea had been taken up as an international standard rather than a limited effort dependent on political mood? And here is the deeper question, the one people avoid because it is cruel to even say aloud. What if that rescue had been designed to keep more families together? The reality is that many children were saved only by being separated from parents who were later murdered. A rescue that saves the child but leaves the parents behind is still rescue, but it also creates a lifelong wound. A child can survive and still carry a grief so heavy it becomes part of their posture. A best-case rescue does not demand family destruction as its price. So imagine this alternative. Countries establish emergency family units, allowing one caregiver to accompany a child, at least in the most endangered cases. They build temporary housing. They coordinate sponsorship and work permits. They make it possible for a mother or father to arrive and contribute rather than remain trapped in a continent that is closing. Would it have been difficult? Yes. Would it have been impossible? No. This is where the record becomes brutal. Many governments were willing to accept the idea of children because children could be framed as charity. Adults required politics. Adults required jobs, housing, integration. Adults required the public to see refugees not as guests, but as neighbors. So the best-case scenario demands something that is rare: public courage. Leadership that tells its people the truth and asks them to live up to it. Now, let me take you into the third channel, the one that did not rely on official generosity at all. The underground. The hiding places, the false names, the children who survived by becoming someone else. When people say hidden children, they often picture a single scene: a child in an attic, a child behind a wall. That did happen, but hiding was also movement. A child passed from one household to another. A child living in a convent, learning prayers, trying to imitate the cadence of a new identity. A child on a farm, suddenly expected to know how to work as if they had always belonged there. Every hidden child lived with the constant possibility of discovery. Not only by police, but by neighbors, by hunger, by illness, by an innocent mistake. A child forgetting a name. A child answering too quickly to the wrong word. A child wetting the bed in a strange house and revealing stress the adults did not want others to notice. And this is where the best-case scenario becomes painfully concrete. What if the underground networks had been supplied like a wartime operation? Not with slogans, with money, documents, food, safe houses, transport, and coordination. I have read accounts of rescuers scrambling for ration carts, bribing officials, risking their lives to obtain false papers, taking children to doctors under the cover of night because sickness is loud and indiscreet. A child with fever can undo months of careful concealment. Now imagine the underground with stable support. Imagine safe corridors funded to move children away from hot zones. Imagine standardized false documentation techniques shared across networks. Imagine medical access arranged with sympathetic professionals. Imagine caches of clothing, food, and identity materials ready for rapid relocation. Would it have saved everyone? No. But it would have reduced the number of children lost to preventable failures. And it would have reduced the burden on individual rescuers who often collapsed under the weight of constant risk. If you want to measure the moral health of societies, look at how many people were willing to hide a child and how many were willing to betray one. The best-case scenario is not that every family becomes heroic. It is that the courageous are supported so their courage has leverage. Now I want to speak directly to you because this is where history can become too abstract. Think about what it means for a child to be told, "You are not who you are." Adults can do this with context. Children must do it with instinct. They must internalize rules that contradict the natural hunger to speak, to laugh, to belong. They must become careful. In some survivors, that carefulness never left. They grew into adults who could read a room instantly, who noticed every exit, who slept lightly, who distrusted abundance. That is not a personality trait. It is survival residue. Now, the fourth channel is the one people least want to imagine, but it must be named. Endurance inside sealed systems, ghettos, camps. Displaced persons holding places that were meant to be temporary but became long months of uncertainty. Children endured hunger, fear, separation, and the strange collapse of time when every day feels like a test you did not study for. Some children were protected by older siblings, by parents who did everything possible to shield them, by strangers who chose kindness in an environment designed to punish kindness. Some children survived because they were moved at the right moment. Some survived because they were hidden inside work assignments or overlooked. Some survived because they learned quickly when to speak and when to disappear. In a best-case scenario, the world does not leave children to endure sealed systems until the war ends. The world attacks those systems by widening exits and by treating information as action. Here is one of the most difficult what-if questions of all. What if the outside powers had responded to reports of mass murder and deportation with more aggressive refugee policy and rescue logistics during the war itself? Not after. During. People argue about what could have been done militarily. I am not going to make this a fantasy of perfect interventions. War is not a clean instrument, but there is a category of action that does not require imaginary victories. Refugee intake, corridors for minors, neutral transit routes, diplomatic pressure for prisoner lists, and child evacuations. The deployment of resources to locate and extract children from areas where hiding networks were operating. The best-case scenario uses the same discipline used to move wartime materials and applies it to human survival. Because a child does not need the entire war to be won to be saved. A child needs one path out. Now, let me slow down here and show you what best case looks like without turning history into a fairy tale. It looks like governments using their bureaucracies as rescue engines. It looks like simplified paperwork for minors and those accompanying them. It looks like sponsorship programs built at scale. It looks like a public narrative that frames rescue not as optional charity but as a national responsibility. It looks like religious and civic institutions mobilized to house and support children. It looks like coordinated efforts across borders, not scattered efforts dependent on a few brave individuals. And if you think that sounds too modern, too organized, too far from the mid-century, remember what the world was already doing at the same time. Rationing, mass mobilization, industrial coordination, international conferences. The capacity existed. It was simply not applied with the same urgency to endangered children. Now we come to the fifth channel, the one that begins when the war ends, when the camps are opened, when the displaced begin to move, when the word liberation enters the vocabulary. People like to treat that moment as closure. It is not closure. For child survivors, it is the beginning of a second life, and that second life can be as disorienting as the first was brutal. Children emerged with altered identities. Some did not know their birth names. Some had been baptized, renamed, raised in hiding under a different religion. Some had been told their parents were dead. Some did not know whether that was true. Some discovered the truth later in pieces, and that discovery can shatter a person even decades after the event. So the best-case scenario here is not simply food and shelter. It is identity repair. It is reunification systems that move fast. It is educational pathways designed specifically for those who lost years of schooling. It is psychological support that recognizes trauma not as weakness, but as a predictable consequence of living through the collapse of a world. It is community building so that a child who survived does not have to survive alone. When survivors speak of the months after liberation, you hear this theme again and again. The body is free, but the mind remains in a posture of vigilance. The world is quiet, but silence can be frightening because silence can sound like waiting for the next knock. A best-case post-war response treats this as a public health and social repair mission. It does not leave it to chance or charity alone. Now let me tell you something that will make some people uncomfortable because it punctures the heroic narrative that many prefer. Even after the war, the world was slow. The world argued over papers and ownership and borders while children waited. The world was exhausted, yes, but exhaustion does not absolve. Many children were placed in institutions, hostels, camps for displaced persons, orphanages, and recovery programs. Some programs were life-changing and saved these youths from collapsing entirely. Others were under-resourced, overcrowded, and uncertain. In the best-case scenario, those programs are expanded and stabilized immediately. The world builds long-term paths rather than temporary holding. Now, I have given you these channels. I have shown you where the best-case outcomes live. But you might still be wondering what this looks like in the texture of a real child's experience. So let me bring you back from policy to life, because life is where the story belongs. A child in hiding. She learns to listen for footsteps in a staircase. She learns that some sounds mean safety and others mean danger. She learns the faces of adults as if they are weather patterns. She learns that even kindness can be unpredictable. In a best-case world, she is hidden with better support. The family hiding her has enough food and does not fear extra ration scrutiny. A sympathetic doctor is available if she becomes ill. The child is moved strategically when danger increases, not only when it becomes immediate. She has a stable story practiced gently, not harshly, because harsh practice can break a child. A child in a ghetto. He sees hunger become the main clock of the day. He sees adults barter, work, and argue under pressure. He learns that children can be useful, slipping through gaps, carrying items, watching for patrols. In a best-case world, there are more exits, more legal routes earlier, more resources to underground routes, more international pressure for humanitarian access, more willingness to treat the lives inside sealed areas as an emergency. A child sent on a rescue transport. He arrives in a foreign country and does not understand the language. He does not know whether his parents will follow. He tries to behave well because he believes gratitude is his ticket to survival. In a best-case world, he arrives into a system that expects trauma. He is placed with families prepared for what it means to receive a child who carries loss. He receives language education quickly. He receives cultural support so that survival does not require identity erasure. He has access to others like him because isolation can be another kind of damage. A child after liberation. She is free, but she is not settled. She does not know whether her family exists. She has learned to survive by not expecting the future. Now, adults tell her to plan. In a best-case world, a tracing system connects survivors more quickly. Legal pathways allow reunification. Education systems provide accelerated schooling. Communities offer continuity. She is allowed to grow, not forced to pretend she is immediately healed. Now let me take you into another what-if scenario, one that people often misunderstand because they think it is only about rescue, when in fact it is also about information. What if the world had believed the reports sooner? In those years, information did move. Refugees spoke, resistance networks transmitted warnings, governments received reports. Newspapers carried stories, sometimes cautiously, sometimes buried, but belief is not automatic. Belief requires moral imagination. It requires people to accept that something unthinkable is happening, and then to act as if it matters. In a best-case timeline, the public in major countries is confronted with the truth earlier and more persistently, not in occasional headlines, but in sustained campaigns. Religious leaders, civic leaders, and politicians speak clearly. Aid organizations are funded robustly. Pressure is applied. Refugee policies are widened. Rescue becomes a recognized wartime mission, not a side concern. Now, I am not naive. Even with belief, rescue would have been hard. But disbelief gave the perpetrators time. Time was their ally. Delay was their weapon. So the best-case scenario reduces delay. Now let me offer you a set of what-if branches, each one grounded in something that did happen in smaller form. What if more neutral countries had opened wider transit pathways for children, turning small corridors into stable routes? What if more diplomats had been empowered to issue protective documentation at scale, with backing rather than punishment for taking initiative? What if international humanitarian organizations had been given broader access and stronger mandates regarding minors? What if resistance and rescue networks had been treated as strategically important rather than tolerated quietly? What if the post-war world had created an international child survivor recovery program with shared funding and standards rather than relying on uneven charity and local capacity? Each of these has precedent in partial form. The best-case scenario is the act of scaling. Now, you might ask, why does this matter? Why not simply tell the real story and leave the alternate roads alone? Because the alternate roads reveal the responsibility. If there was nothing anyone could do, then the story is only tragedy. But if there were doors that could have been opened wider, then the story is also indictment. And that indictment is not meant to fuel guilt for its own sake. It is meant to sharpen our understanding of how systems fail children under pressure. Now let me return to the lived atmosphere of the time, because it matters for authenticity. In occupied Europe, the air was often full of rumors. People listened to illegal radios. They traded information in whispers. They tried to interpret every new decree. They tried to decide whether to flee, whether to hide, whether to comply, whether compliance might buy time. Parents were forced into decisions no parent should face. Do you send your child away with strangers, perhaps never to see them again, or do you keep them close and risk losing them anyway? Do you hide your child and risk the lives of those who hide them? Do you trust a forged document? Do you cross a border at night? Do you wait one more week because the situation cannot possibly get worse? It could get worse. It often did. The best case scenario is not that parents suddenly become all-knowing. It is that the world around them provides clearer options sooner. Because many parents were trapped not by lack of courage, but by lack of viable routes. Now, I want to speak of the children who wrote, because their voices form a kind of chorus that cannot be replaced by our commentary. A diary is not only writing, it is a declaration of personhood. It says, I think, I feel, I notice. I am not merely a victim shaped by forces beyond my control. When a child writes about hunger, about fear, about daily humiliations, about hopes and resentments and small joys, they are doing something the persecutors did not intend to allow. They are preserving a human record. In a best-case world, more of those records survive because more children survive. More paper exists. More hiding places keep possessions intact. More families remain to preserve the notebooks after the war. More institutions prioritize collecting these voices sooner, before time and displacement scatter them. Now, as we move deeper into this story, I want you to stay alert to a particular danger. The danger of turning survival into a neat arc of inspiration. Survival is not a morality play. Many survivors lived because of help. Many died despite help. Some lived because of chance. Some died because of chance. To respect these children, you must resist the temptation to tidy the story. But you can still learn from it. Here is the core lesson of every best-case scenario we have discussed. In moments of mass danger, saving children is not primarily a question of individual heroism. It is a question of systems. Heroism matters, but heroism cannot replace capacity. If you want a world where more children survive, you build systems that make rescue possible at scale. Now, let me bring you to the end of this segment with a scene that I have carried in my mind for years because it captures the post-war world in a single image. A child survivor, newly arrived in a place of recovery, stands in a doorway. The room is safe. There is food. There are clean blankets. Adults speak gently. And still, the child hesitates. Because when your earliest memories teach you that safety is temporary, you do not step into it easily. That hesitation is the true measure of what was taken. Not only lives, but trust in the world itself. So here's the question I want to leave with you, a question that belongs not only to history, but to your own time. If you could go back to the moment when the doors were still only half closed, when policy debates still mattered, when rescue still had room to expand, would you have demanded more, loudly, publicly, even if it made people uncomfortable? And if a crisis like that appears again under different names, will we recognize the hinge points in time? If this made you stop and think, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with your classmates and friends, and tell me in the comments which single hinge point you believe would have saved the most children if the world had acted faster. Before you answer that question, the one about hinge points and whether you would have demanded more, I want you to sit with something quieter. A child can be handed safety and still not believe it. That is not stubbornness. That is education by terror. I have watched survivors describe their first nights after liberation or after arrival in a safe place. The bed is real. The food is real. The voices are gentle. And still the mind waits for the old pattern to return, because the old pattern had become law. Knock, shouting, running, hiding, loss. Now, here is the hook I want to put in front of you, not to entertain you, but to sharpen the story. What if the world had understood that rescue is only the first half of survival? What if the second half, the repair, had been treated as urgent as extraction? Because when we say Holocaust children, we are not only speaking about whether a child lived through the war. We are speaking about what happened next when the war ended but the child's life did not automatically become whole again. And if you think this is a postscript, you are wrong. For the children who survived, the post-war years were a second battlefield. One fought in paperwork, identity, custody battles, schoolrooms, orphanages, displaced persons camps, and in the private war inside the mind. So let me take you forward step by step, with the same discipline we have used so far, staying close to the real world, and then widening the lens just enough to see the best-case roads that history left half-built. I am going to walk you through 3 new what-if scenarios, each one grounded in realities that already existed. What if the tracing of children and reunification of families had been organized globally, immediately, with speed and authority, instead of being slow, fragmented, and overwhelmed? What if the major receiving countries had created child-centered immigration pathways after the war that were large enough to meet the need, not small enough to look polite? What if the world had protected the identities of hidden children and respected the complexity of their belonging instead of forcing simplified outcomes that often created new wounds? Now let us return to the year 1945, because that year is often spoken of as a single turning point. It was not. It was a series of turning points that arrived unevenly depending on where you were standing. In some cities, liberation meant soldiers in the streets, celebration, a sudden reversal of power. In other places, it meant days of confusion and danger as authority collapsed and revenge and scarcity took over. For children, even the end of a war can feel like another upheaval rather than a clean release. And the first truth you must face is this: a child who survived often did not emerge into a family. They emerged into a question. Who am I now? Where do I belong? Who is left? I have seen records where a child's name appears in one place, spelled one way, and then appears again elsewhere, spelled another way, because someone heard it wrong, because the child forgot the old spelling, because the child had been living under a new identity and could not easily switch back. Multiply that confusion by thousands, and you begin to see what the post-war world faced and what it failed to fully meet. The surviving children were found in many places. Some in displaced persons camps, where crowds of the uprooted gathered with little certainty about the future. Some in orphanages, established quickly, often by humanitarian groups trying to bring order to chaos. Some in convents and foster homes, still under false names, still living as the child they had been forced to become. Some were older youths, teenagers hardened by work camps and years of hunger, young enough to be called children, but old enough to carry themselves like adults. Now, you have heard people speak of rehabilitation homes, places where groups of child survivors were brought to recover. Those places matter, and they matter for more than sentiment. They were experiments in what a repaired life could look like. Imagine a group of children who have learned not to trust food because food can vanish. They eat quickly, they hoard, they hide bread in pockets, not because they are greedy, because their bodies learned a rule, and the rule is that abundance is temporary and hunger always returns. Imagine trying to teach them the opposite. Imagine trying to introduce schooling to children who have been living for years in survival mode. You do not simply open a book and begin a lesson. You have to rebuild attention itself. You have to convince them that the future is real enough to plan for. That is why the best-case scenario here is not vague kindness. It is organized care. And now I will ask you a question that should make you uncomfortable if you are taking this seriously. Why was organized care treated as a local effort rather than a global mission? After the war, governments could coordinate reconstruction, currency policy, borders, and industrial repair. They could rebuild rail lines in cities. They could negotiate treaties. They could create new international structures. So why did child survivor recovery so often depend on scattered programs, uneven charity, and the endurance of children who had already endured too much? That question leads us into the first new what if. What if there had been an international child tracing and reunification authority designed specifically to locate children, verify identities, and reunite families where possible, with rapid procedures and strong access to records? You might think, surely that existed. Parts of it existed. Tracing services existed. People worked relentlessly. But the scale was overwhelming. The documentation was shattered. Borders were chaotic, and time itself worked against truth. Every month that passed allowed memories to fade and false identities to harden into permanence. In the best-case scenario, the world would have treated child tracing like an emergency logistics problem, a standardized registry system across occupied zones, dedicated staff trained in multiple languages, agreements for immediate access to civil records, camp records, hospital lists, and orphanage rosters. Rapid transport to reunite children with relatives. Legal frameworks to resolve custody disputes quickly and fairly, with the child's welfare as the center rather than national pride or institutional interest. Now I want you to see why this matters. Because without it, a child could be found and still be lost. A hidden child might have lived for years under a Christian name, baptized, trained, protected. The family that hid the child might have grown to love the child as their own. A surviving relative might return after the war, broken, alone, and demand the child back. This is not a clean story. It is not a story with villains and saints. It is a story where love, fear, religion, and grief collide. In the best-case scenario, the world acknowledges the complexity rather than pretending one solution fits all. It creates processes that respect both the rescue that occurred and the identity that was stolen. Now let us stay with hidden children for a moment because they embody one of the sharpest contradictions of survival. To survive, they had to disappear. To rebuild a life, they had to reappear. And reappearing can be frightening when your entire education has taught you that visibility is deadly. In testimony, you hear it in the smallest details. The way a hidden child remembers learning to walk a certain way, to sit a certain way, to answer to a new name without hesitation. The way a child learned to listen for the sound of boots, to understand when adults were lying to protect them, to accept that truth itself had become dangerous. Now, imagine the post-war moment. The danger has shifted, but the habits remain. A child hears a knock and freezes. A child is offered food and eats quickly, expecting it to be taken away. A child is told to speak their original language again and cannot find the words. This is where the best-case scenario requires psychological intelligence, even if mid-century society did not use the language we use today. The best-case scenario provides consistent caretakers, stable routines, schooling designed for interrupted lives, and spaces where survivors can speak without being forced into gratitude performances. Because here is another ugly truth. Survivors were often expected to perform recovery, to appear grateful, to appear brave, to appear finished with the past. But the past does not leave on command. Now, let me shift to the second new what-if. Because it is where politics and rescue meet again, this time after the war. What if receiving countries had created large-scale child and youth immigration programs, not limited by narrow quotas, designed specifically to absorb the surviving children and give them stable futures? In the real world, many survivors emigrated. Some went to Britain, some to the United States, some to Canada, some to Australia, some to South America, some to Palestine, which would soon become Israel, and many rebuilt lives in Europe despite everything. But the processes were slow, and the destinations often depended on sponsorship, paperwork, and the luck of connections. A child could wait in a displaced person's camp, not because no one wanted them safe, but because the legal doors were narrow. Now imagine a best-case post-war program, a standardized pathway for child survivors with priority processing, education and apprenticeship programs integrated into immigration so that youths could transition quickly into study and work, guaranteed housing and foster networks supported by the state, not just by charity, language education built into the first year with cultural continuity respected rather than erased, In other words, a system that recognizes that a child survivor is not only a refugee, but a future citizen in need of structured rebuilding. If you want to know why this matters, consider the alternative. When the doors are narrow, children remain in temporary places longer. Temporary places become permanent wounds. Adolescents become adults without stable education. Trauma deepens. Identity confusion hardens. The world loses not only the child's peace, but the child's potential. This is not sentimental. It is practical. And now I will offer you a third. What if? One that lives at the intersection of rescue and information, and it returns us to a question we touched earlier. What if the world had used documentation as a form of protection earlier and more aggressively? You might think documentation is cold. It is not. Documentation can be a shield. A child with papers can cross a border that a child without papers cannot. A child with a recognized identity can be traced after the war, rather than vanishing into a fog of unknown names. A child whose existence is recorded is harder to erase completely. The persecution systems understood this. They understood the power of lists and records. They used them for harm. The best-case scenario uses records for rescue. Earlier issuance of protective papers by sympathetic officials. Earlier creation of registries of displaced children by humanitarian groups. Earlier coordination of name databases, family links, and tracing mechanisms. This does not sound dramatic, but it saves lives. It prevents children from becoming permanent ghosts. Now, let me bring the narrative back down into lived scenes again, because it is easy to get lost in program design. Picture an orphanage in the post-war years, crowded, understaffed, full of children with wildly different experiences. Some were hidden, some were in camps. Some were born in hiding and do not remember before. Some remember everything too clearly. A caretaker tries to impose routine, breakfast at the same time, lessons, chores, quiet hours. But the children do not share the same internal world. One child cannot sleep in a room with many others because crowds mean danger. Another cannot sleep alone because alone means abandonment. One child hoards bread. Another refuses to eat because appetite feels like betrayal of those who died. These are not moral issues. They are survival adaptations. In a best-case scenario, that orphanage is not overcrowded. It is staffed properly. It has medical care. It has education designed for disrupted childhood. It has pathways out into stable families and communities. In the real world, some places approached this, some did not. The unevenness is part of the story. Now, I want to return to Britain for a moment because there is a scene there that captures both the possibility and the limitation of post-war recovery programs. Groups of child survivors were brought to a place of rest and rehabilitation. They were fed, clothed, taught, given structure. They began to rediscover laughter. They began to imagine work, education, future. This mattered, and I will not diminish it. But I also want you to understand what it could not do. It could not restore parents. It could not erase nightmares. It could not instantly teach the body that safety was real. And it could not substitute for a global system that would have met every surviving child with the same seriousness. This is why the best-case scenario remains relevant, not because we want to rewrite history, but because the contrast reveals the scale of what was missing. Now, you might be wondering where the wartime what-if scenarios go from here. You might think we have moved too far into post-war. But the truth is, the post-war outcomes are shaped by wartime decisions. The channels connect. If more children had been rescued earlier through legal escape and organized programs, fewer would have needed hiding. Fewer would have endured ghettos and camps. More would have arrived in safe countries with parents alive, with identities intact, with education less shattered. So the best-case scenario is cumulative. Early action reduces later damage. Now, let me take you back briefly to the wartime years with a specific focus, the youth rescue networks inside occupied Europe. There were organizations and individuals who specialized in moving children, hiding them, finding placements, and creating false papers. In France, for example, there were child aid networks that worked with extraordinary courage. Across Europe, Jewish and non-Jewish rescuers created webs of protection. The best-case scenario here is the same theme again. Scale. What if those child rescue networks had received reliable outside support earlier? Funding, materials, communication, evacuation routes. And here is the hard part. Outside support required governments to prioritize rescue. It required intelligence services to treat child rescue as a mission. It required diplomacy to push neutral corridors. It required public pressure. In other words, it required adults with power to treat children's lives as wartime priorities. Now, I want to turn to another group that is often overlooked in popular narratives. Adolescents. Teenage survivors sit in a strange category. They are old enough to have taken on adult responsibilities during the war, sometimes working, caring for younger children, making life and death decisions. Yet after the war, they were still expected to become students, apprentices, young workers, as if they could simply resume a normal developmental path. Many could not. Some did, through sheer will and with help. But the best-case scenario recognizes that adolescents require a different kind of recovery plan than small children. Vocational training, apprenticeships, accelerated education, structured mentorship, community integration, legal support for immigration, and psychological care that respects the way war forced maturity onto them prematurely. If you want a viral History Channel moment, here it is. Ask yourself, what happens to a society when it fails to rebuild its surviving youth? The answer is not only personal tragedy. It is lost capacity, lost leadership, lost community. Now, let me offer you a set of best-case branches that apply specifically to the post-war years, because this is where history often narrows into a simple story of survival. It should not. Branch 1. What if the displaced persons camps had been treated as temporary by design, with strict time limits and rapid resettlement, rather than becoming long-term holding places? Branch 2. What if custody disputes over hidden children had been handled by specialized courts with child welfare expertise, rather than by institutional tug-of-war? Branch 3. What if education ministries in receiving countries had created dedicated survivor schooling tracks with language support, trauma-informed teaching, and accelerated pathways to higher education and skilled work? Branch 4. What if the world had created a coordinated survivor documentation initiative immediately, recording names, stories, and family links before time scattered them further? Branch 5. What if survivor communities had been supported financially and socially so that children could rebuild identity in the presence of others who understood, rather than being isolated in homes where no one could comprehend what they had lived through? Every one of these branches has evidence in partial form. The best-case scenario is the act of choosing them widely and early. Now, I want to speak to you directly again, because this is where your mind might try to protect itself by turning away. Do not. There is a temptation to treat child survivor stories as inspiring proof that humans can endure anything. That is a comforting message, but it is also lazy. Endurance is not the goal. Protection is the goal. If a child survives, it is not a reason to relax. It is a reason to ask why the child had to survive at all. Now, let me bring us back to the central thread, the one continuous story we have been building. We began with childhood interrupted, with restrictions tightening, with families trying to escape, with some children being rescued, others hidden, others trapped in sealed systems. We moved into the post-war world, where survival continued in new forms, where identity and recovery became the next struggle. And now we reach a point where the story becomes almost unbearable in its quietness. Because after the war, many children had to decide whether to remember. That sounds strange, because you might think memory is automatic. It is not. Some survivors did not speak for decades. Not because they forgot, but because speaking would have reopened a wound that they were using all their strength to keep closed. Others spoke early, driven by the need to make the world understand. And here is another best-case scenario that sits at the edge of history and ethics. What if the world had made it safer to speak sooner? Not by demanding testimony, but by creating environments where survivors were believed, supported, and not turned into spectacles. If societies had listened earlier and more respectfully, perhaps survivors would not have carried so much of the burden alone. Now, you may be asking, where are the children's own voices in this part of the story? They are everywhere, even when they are silent. They appear in the way survivors describe a single object, held onto across years, a doll, a ring, a notebook, a drawing. They appear in the way a survivor remembers learning a new name and fearing to forget the old one. They appear in the way a survivor remembers the first time they ate without fear and the guilt that followed. They appear in the way a survivor describes meeting others like them and feeling for the first time that they were not alone in the world. If you want to understand survival, you must understand community, because one of the most damaging effects of persecution was isolation. Isolation of families, isolation of children, isolation of identity. The best-case scenario always rebuilds community quickly. Now, I will end this section with a different kind of hook, one that points forward. Imagine a single ledger, not a cold bureaucratic artifact, but a living map of names. A child's name recorded correctly, a mother's name linked to it, a last known address, a date of departure, a note about a hiding place, a note about a foster family, a note about a surviving aunt in another country. Now imagine that ledger in 1945, not decades later, available immediately to those who were searching, coordinated across borders. How many reunions would have happened sooner? How many children would have been spared years of uncertainty? How many identities would have been recovered before they hardened into permanent confusion? This is not a fantasy of perfection. It is a reminder of what organization can do when it chooses to serve life rather than harm. So here is my question for you, and I want you to answer it like a serious person, not like someone scrolling for entertainment, which would have saved more children overall. The earlier widening of escape and rescue before the war reached its most lethal phase, or the immediate creation of a global post-war recovery and reunification system that prevented surviving children from being lost a second time. Share this with your classmates and friends, and in the comments tell me which best-case scenario you think is the most realistic, not the most dramatic, the one you believe history could have delivered if enough adults had decided that children were worth the political cost. If you answered that last question too quickly, I do not trust your answer, because the honest response is that both would have saved lives, but in different ways, at different times, and with different kinds of courage. Early rescue is courage before certainty. Post-war repair is courage after exhaustion. One demands imagination, the other demands discipline. And now, as we come to the end of this chronicle, I am going to do what a careful historian must do, even when it hurts. I am going to tie the strands together, not into a comforting knot, but into a clear pattern you can recognize again if history ever tries to repeat itself. We began with childhood interrupted. We followed children into 5 channels of survival: legal escape, organized rescue, underground concealment, endurance inside sealed systems, and the long, uneven work of recovery. Along the way, we tested best-case roads, not as entertainment, but as an accounting exercise. The point was never to fantasize that evil could be wished away. The point was to show where the world had leverage and failed to use it at scale. Now I want to give you a hook for this final stretch, because what comes next is the most unsettling what-if of all. What if the Holocaust did not only destroy children's lives? What if it also trained the world to accept, quietly, that children can be treated as collateral? That is the poison that lingers after the bodies are buried and the borders are redrawn. It is the normalization of delay. It is the habit of saying, "This is tragic," instead of saying, "This is preventable." So I am going to lay out the final set of best-case scenarios, and then I will bring you back to the real children, the real objects, the real silences, and the real rebuilding, because no theory matters if it cannot honor actual human lives. Here are the final scenarios. First, the best case of timing. Earlier recognition, earlier action, earlier widening of legal doors before the machinery of removal reached full speed. Second, the best case of scale, taking the rescue models that did work and multiplying them beyond what politics considered comfortable. Third, the best case of support, treating underground child protection as a strategic mission with resources, not a romantic tale that relied on individual sacrifice. Fourth, the best case of repair, treating post-war child recovery as a global responsibility with standardized systems, not a scattered patchwork of goodwill. Now I will show you how all four connect, because they are not separate roads. They are one road with four gates. If you leave one gate narrow, the pressure crushes people at the next gate. If legal escape is restricted, more children must be hidden. If hiding networks are under-resourced, more children are trapped in sealed systems. If sealed systems are not interrupted, liberation produces more orphans, more trauma, more identity confusion. If post-war repair is weak, survival becomes a lifelong struggle rather than a restored life. That is the chain. That is the architecture of child survival in a world that failed. Now let me return to the real post-war moment, the one people love to summarize as afterwards. Afterwards is a lie. Nothing ends cleanly after a catastrophe. The war ended on paper before it ended in the nervous system. For children especially, time does not behave politely. A child emerges from hiding and faces questions that feel like accusations. Who are you? What is your real name? Where were you? Why did you survive? Where are your parents? A child arrives in a recovery home and is told to sleep in a bed, in a room with clean walls, and the child cannot, because quiet is not peace. Quiet is anticipation. A teenager is offered education and feels insulted by the simplicity of lessons because war made them old and now peace asks them to become young again. And across all these stories, one theme keeps surfacing. Survivors did not only need food and shelter, they needed a future that made sense. This is where the best-case scenario of repair becomes so important and also so neglected in popular memory. People love rescue stories because rescue has a clear moment. A train departs, a border is crossed, a child is saved. Repair is slow. Repair is tedious. Repair requires money and patience and understanding, and it produces no dramatic victory. It produces something quieter, a child who learns to plan a week ahead without fear. So in a best-case post-war world, what would have been different? You would have seen a coordinated child tracing system that moved faster than rumor. You would have seen trained staff in every displaced persons region whose only job was to locate minors, verify identities, connect surviving relatives, and make reunification safe and swift when possible. You would have seen receiving nations compete in generosity instead of compete in caution. You would have seen immigration pathways designed for survivors with priority processing, with education built in, with housing and foster networks supported as a public service rather than treated as a private charity burden. You would have seen legal frameworks for custody disputes that centered the child's welfare and identity complexity. Because hidden children were not parcels to be returned or trophies to be kept. They were human beings who had survived by becoming someone else. A best-case system would have respected the emotional reality of a child who loved the family that hid them and still needed to recover the family they lost, if any family remained. And you would have seen something else, something rare for the mid-century. You would have seen societies admit openly that psychological injuries were real, expected, and deserving of care. Not to medicalize grief, but to prevent the quiet destruction that follows trauma when people are told to simply move on. Now, you might be tempted to say, of course that is what should have happened. But the honest historian does not stop at should. The honest historian asks, could it have happened? Yes. Not perfectly, not everywhere, not without conflict, but yes. Because the post-war world was capable of organizing enormous systems quickly when political leadership treated them as essential. Reconstruction is proof. New international institutions are proof. Mass resettlements occurred. The machinery existed. The question again is priority. Now, Let me take you back to the wartime hinge points one last time, because if we do not, we risk placing all moral responsibility on the post-war era, as if the war years were beyond reach. They were not beyond reach. There were warning signs, there were policy debates, there were refugee lines at consulates, there were ships that could have sailed fuller. There were quotas that could have been expanded. There were officials who could have issued more papers. There were leaders who could have spoken more clearly and earlier, not in careful language, but in language that forced a public to face reality. And here, in this final section, I want to give you the most ruthless best-case scenario of all. It is ruthless because it exposes how unglamorous salvation really is. What if the world had treated visas like lifeboats, not like privileges? If you accept that principle, everything changes. Children do not wait for perfect sponsorship. Children do not wait for impossible financial proof. Children do not wait until the crisis is so obvious it is too late. You create emergency categories. You create humanitarian corridors. You reduce procedural friction. You stop treating rescue as a favor and start treating it as a duty. Now, let me bring in the organized child rescue efforts again. We spoke earlier about the children transported to safety before the war closed every door. That rescue happened, and it should never be minimized. But it also reveals an accusation hidden inside its success. If nearly 10,000 could be saved through one focused effort, then saving more was not a question of possibility. It was a question of will. So imagine the best-case expansion. Multiple countries coordinate similar programs. They share vetting information. They share sponsorship burdens. They mobilize churches, unions, civic associations, and local councils to house children. They create language education systems immediately. They design placement policies that protect children from exploitation and isolation. They build a pathway for family reunification where possible. That is not fantasy. That is governance. Now imagine if that had been done 2 years earlier. Now imagine if it had been done 5 years earlier. I am not asking you to accept a miracle. I am asking you to accept a fact about timing. The earlier you widen the door, the more people fit through before the hallway fills with smoke. Now let us revisit underground concealment with the same ruthless clarity. Hiding saved lives, but it was never meant to be the primary plan. It was an emergency improvisation in a world where official rescue was insufficient. In a best-case scenario, the underground does not become the default for children. It becomes the backup for children who could not be moved legally. And for the underground to function at scale, it needs support, steady funding, safe houses, medical access, false documentation systems, and coordinated routes. If that support is missing, hiding becomes brittle. One illness, one neighbor's suspicion, one shortage, and the child is exposed. So the best-case scenario invests in the underground, the way the world invested in other wartime missions. Quietly, efficiently, with the understanding that saving children is not secondary to fighting the war. It is part of what fighting the war should mean. Now, let me return to the children themselves, because I do not want you to leave this story with only policy in your mind. Policy explains what could have happened. Children explain what did happen. There are children who survived and kept one object across the years: a doll, a ring, a notebook, a pair of skates, a drawing, a small token of the world before. I have heard survivors describe these objects with more tenderness than they describe grand events, because an object can carry a childhood when memory is too heavy to hold directly. There are children who survived and wrote, sometimes in cramped handwriting, sometimes with a voice too mature for their age. They wrote about hunger, about fear, about everyday humiliations, about the tension inside families under pressure, about hope that persisted without permission. There are children who survived and did not speak for decades because speech felt like reopening a grave. There are children who survived and became adults who built lives that looked ordinary from the outside: jobs, families, routines, and yet carried an inner vigilance that never fully softened. And there are the children who did not survive, whose stories we only know through fragments, through lists, through a photograph with a name on the back, through a diary that stops mid-sentence. So when I say best-case scenario, do not imagine a world without suffering. Imagine a world with fewer stopped sentences. Now, I promise to tie together the narrative into one cohesive piece. So here is the spine, the distilled sequence that runs through everything we have covered. The persecution of children began with exclusion, then escalated into separation and removal. Some children escaped legally if doors opened for them. Some were rescued through organized programs that depended on political will. Many survived only through underground concealment, living under false identities and constant fear. Others endured sealed systems where survival depended on endurance, protection, and chance. When the war ended, survival continued through recovery, tracing, immigration, and the reconstruction of identity, often uneven and slow. Now the final what-if question is not only what could have saved more children then, it is what would have changed in the world after if more children had been saved earlier, with families intact, with education less shattered, with identity less fractured. Because the Holocaust did not only kill people, it transformed societies. It scattered communities. It created demographic voids that cannot be filled. It altered cultural continuity. It left survivors rebuilding in foreign languages, in unfamiliar cities, often without elders, without grandparents, without extended family networks that teach children who they are. So in a best-case world, saving more children also means saving more continuity. It means more families survive together. It means fewer children grow up as solitary witnesses. It means more cultural rebuilding is possible. It means fewer lives are shaped by the permanent question, who would I have been if this had not happened? Now I want to do something that will make this feel immediate, because history becomes useless if it stays behind glass. The hinge points we identified are not unique to that era. They exist in any crisis where children are threatened. Early warning signs, bureaucratic gates, public reluctance, political excuses. Under-resourced rescue networks, slow repair after catastrophe. When those patterns appear, you can predict the outcome. Not because the future is fixed, but because systems behave consistently unless forced to change. So if you want this story to matter, you must carry one simple test into your own time. When children are in danger, does the world widen the doors early, or does it wait until the danger is undeniable and the options are few? Now, I will close in the tone with which I began, not with spectacle, but with an image. I remember sitting in a quiet room with old papers and brittle photographs, the kind of place where history feels less like a subject and more like a presence. I remember the way names looked on a page, so ordinary in ink, and yet each one a full universe that once breathed and laughed and asked questions and expected adults to protect them. And I remember thinking something that still feels like an accusation. We talk as if the past is finished. It is not. The past is a set of lessons the present keeps failing to learn. So here is where I leave you, not with comfort, but with a demand for clarity. The best-case version of this history was never impossible. It was simply expensive in the currency that leaders hate to spend: political risk, speed, and moral focus. Share this with your classmates and friends, and answer me one question in the comments. If you had to pick only one, which single change would have saved the most children? Earlier immigration doors, scaled rescue programs, fully funded underground protection, or a rapid global post-war reunification and recovery system? When you spend enough time with these accounts, you begin to understand that the war did not end on the day the guns quieted. It simply changed its uniform. The battle moved from streets and borders into paper, memory, and the private rooms of the mind. Tonight, we traced the paths that separated life from disappearance. We followed children through narrow exits that depended on a stamp and a signature. We watched rescue efforts that saved some while others remained trapped behind the same closed doors. We stepped into the hush of hidden rooms where a child learned a new name, a new prayer, a new way of breathing. We looked straight at sealed systems where endurance became the only language left. And then we followed the survivors into the aftermath, where freedom did not guarantee wholeness and where a child could be alive and still feel lost. If you want the true cost of secrecy, It is not only the information withheld from newspapers or the details buried in official language. The cost is counted in the extra years a child spent waiting to be found. In the months a teenager spent in a holding camp because the world could not move fast enough to grant a future. In the way survivors learned to hide their hunger, their grief, their accent, their dreams, because even after the danger passed, they had been trained to believe that being visible was risky. And yet, the post-war world was shaped by what these children carried out of the ruins. Nations rebuilt their streets, but survivors rebuilt the meaning of home. Governments drew new lines on maps, but child survivors drew a different kind of line, between the self they were born as and the self they became in order to live. The years that followed were filled with reconstruction and promises, but beneath the public optimism ran a quieter truth. When childhood is targeted, the damage does not stay inside one decade. It echoes forward, into families, into communities, into the way whole societies talk about responsibility. The remarkable thing is not only that some children survived. The remarkable thing is how survival forced them to become witnesses before they were old enough to be anything else. They were made into adults by circumstance, then asked to return to school desks, to polite conversations, to ordinary routines, as if their eyes had not already seen the world's worst capacities. As I close this record, I keep returning to one image, not grand, not dramatic, just stubbornly human. A child holding a small object that made the past feel real. A notebook, a worn sweater, a toy carried across borders, a scrap of paper with a name written carefully so it would not be forgotten. That object is not a symbol for the cameras. It is proof of continuity. It says, I existed before this. I existed during this. I am still here after. I'm left with something I did not expect when I first began following these stories. Not only sorrow, though sorrow belongs here. Not only anger, though anger is honest. I'm left with a kind of quiet astonishment at what survival demanded, and a relentless curiosity about the hinge points we almost missed, the moments when a faster decision, a wider door, a more organized response might have turned a stopped sentence into a life that continued. So here is the question I want to leave you with, one that does not belong only to the past. If you could change one hinge point in this history, what would it be? Opening earlier escape routes, scaling rescue programs, fully supporting underground protection, or building a rapid global system for reunification and recovery the moment the war ended? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our uploads. And as the room grows quiet again, I can almost hear it. The soft rhythm of keys returning to their places, the last page settling flat, and the feeling that this story is finished only on paper. The truth is, it has only begun to ask its questions.